Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it. Right! You tell them I'm coming! And hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio! The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Good evening, folks. This is Diamond with the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, bringing you another edition of The Inconvenient Truth, prepping for the grand solar minimum. Joining us again tonight is my partner, Leah Shaper, and Lee Wheelbarger. He's an inventor, a military electronics specialist, and part-time plasma physicist, apparently. Lee, are you there?
I am.
Yeah, I'm here, sir.
Awesome. The way I was going to structure the show is I think that for the first hour, I'd like to talk about some more timeline progression on the grand solar minimum, the magnetic pole flip, and the timeline of events moving forward. Also, I'd like to talk about strategic location and maybe talk about war games. So, in my eyes, as we move forward into the grand solar minimum, Leah, I think that we are seeing the underpinnings of a narrative taking place right now, where countries are taking sides, and we are literally developing a framework which could result in the next global battle, so to speak. Now, if you look at all the conspiracy sites or go into all the interwebs, this is all related to a world takeover by the New World Order, the Illuminati, the shadow government, the powers that be, whatever you want to call them. This is a big ruse to create mass destruction on a global scale, and then to have a big, like a party in the end. We all come together, hold hands, it's kumbaya, and you get the barcode right on your forehead. Boom. So that being said, are we going to see war games prior to infrastructure failures, like as the weather changes and the crop failures ensue? Obviously, we're going to see prices spike in the markets, and maybe some areas, local areas, there may be unrest because of that. But on a global scale, do you think that the war games will ensue before the natural catastrophes, Lee?
I think they already have war games. The exercise that they had in Texas and California just a few years ago that everybody was in such an uproar about, that was basically a war game to deal with infiltrators within the United States and how for our military to be able to blend in the event that there were within the United States, that they would have to go in and pull back out, as far as to capture or arrest or however you want to put that. So there are different war games. DHS has done different research, and different government agencies deal with different types of catastrophes, FEMA, the American Red Cross, and they look at all of these different things and run computer scenarios. And then do put personnel out in the field and do different exercises for basically any type of a catastrophe that you can think of. So yeah, that is done. As far as the New World Order taking over and, everyone having a master plan, anybody that's involved in combat knows that no plan works past first contact with the enemy. And I think that there are going to be so many things happening in so many different places that so many people have not thought about, that they're going to be dealing with calamities of their own, and their best laid plans are going to go to ruin. So That's my take on it. I think that each government will move like a chess game, well-played chess game, or if you're a a Star Trek fan, the three-layered chess board. Because you do have groups like Illuminati and Soros and so on and so forth, but then you do also have outsiders, like Putin, and then renegades in foreign countries, and then of course you have to deal with the Chinese as well. And the Japanese are, they're not huge, but they do have an influence. So, there's a lot of different players in the game when you look at this globally, and there are a lot of lives at stake when you talk about this really, coming into fruition here in the years coming forward. So, that's my take on it.
Leah, do you have any thing to add?
Well, yeah, I was thinking after our episode last week, it sort of gave me a little bit of new perspective perhaps on Trump's border wall with Mexico. And it sort of made me wonder if perhaps that was an attempt to anticipate people moving across borders in the event of, it getting colder, and a way of controlling people. And it also brings to mind a lot of the practice runs we've had in recent years for grid down failures, which is probably not a bad idea regardless. And then I also wonder, too, about bunkers that high-end bunkers that wealthy elite people have been building, and wondering how all of that fits in, and do these people know what's coming, and is that why they're going into underground bunkers and building them?
Well, I would say yes to most of those. The high-end bunkers, to start with, they are popping up, like spring flowers. And there are lots and lots of very wealthy people who are investing in facilities and underground facilities, remote locations, yachts with solar power and backup. So there are a lot of people who are aware. Well, let's put it this way. There are a lot more people who are aware that this is going on and are preparing silently than you think.
Yeah, Nita Kelly talked about that. The number one rule about preparing is don't tell anyone you're preparing.
Yes.
Don't tell them where your supplies are, certainly.
Right. So, there was an exodus of people out of Chicago as far as multimillionaires. And it was brought to my attention that all of these people were exodusing, out of Chicago in large numbers and leaving, all of these high-rise penthouses for sale. So, there's always, real estate available. And a friend, mine brought it to my attention. And I was like, well, why are all of these people leaving? And he's like, dude, they know what's going on. And they're getting out. They're going, south of the border and, down to tropical areas and buying islands and big yachts and all kinds of things. And then, there are people going down into the central parts of, the Adirondack Mountains and down in Kentucky and Tennessee and so on and so forth. And they're, buying up caves and, digging holes in the ground and getting next to rivers and all kinds of other things. But they're leaving, the New Madrid Fault out of their equation. So, there's a lot of people who are preparing. And, the governments are doing it. The Russians are really, really big into preparing. I mean, as far as I know, the Russians are the number one country in the world as far as the most money spent and the most committed to their population and the most committed to producing vehicles and equipment specifically for sub-zero temperature operations, flooding, ice and snow. I mean, if you look at their the Sherpa vehicle that they've built, and the fact that they just took the articulated. Russia has a very nice, and has for years, a nice articulated tracked vehicle. It's like a tank with another tank behind it, and it bends in the middle like an articulated wheeled loader. And it can actually raise the front of it up. So not only does it bend, left and right, but it can raise the nose of the front of it up by, hydraulically making it look like a V, or making it look like an N, by bending it up and down in the middle. And it's worked extremely well for really, really bad terrain for decades. And so the people who have produced the Sherp vehicle, which is not a tracked vehicle, it has huge, it actually looks like a small four-wheel drive vehicle with monster tires on it that only have like 2 or 3 pounds in them. There's no suspension to it whatsoever, and it uses a little 4-cylinder diesel engine. And I think it produces like 170 horsepower. And so, it can move like almost like 4 or 5 knots through the water, and it'll move almost like 40 knots across land, and it'll go, on top of the snow and bounce right into the water and float like a beach ball across the top of the water and climb up onto the ice on the other side and keep on going. So they've now taken that vehicle, which has been extremely successful within their military and trials and driving it all over the world in Siberia and all this other stuff. They actually drove a pair of them like 100,000 miles or something just to prove how dependable they were. So painted them white so as they were look peaceful, but they were actually owned by the Russian military when they were driving them all over Russia. So they've taken this larger package and put it on the back of it with the articulated module in the middle, and instead of having 4 wheels on the rear module, it has 6. So now it's a 10-wheeled articulated vehicle. All 10 wheels drive, and what it allows them to do is put missile platforms and other weapons packages and troop transports and supplies to allow them to go out for longer distances, resupply, carrying fuel, and carrying all of these other things using this articulated module in the middle that is very, very successful in some of their other vehicles. Because if you've heard some of my previous shows, I talked about during this last May Day parade in Russia that they had new articulated tracked vehicles that were painted in Arctic camo. And this is the first time that they had those type vehicles. Number one, articulated with missile launchers on them, but 2, had painted them in Arctic camo. And they went out and did the testing with those, and I think they found out that those missile launchers are so heavy that it's making it really difficult for those vehicles to get through. And so because of that, they've decided to move that over to this Sherpa, and that's why they've made the second part of the Sherpa 6 wheels and such a bathtub type thing to make it more buoyant to be able to carry those missile launchers on the back of it across the water. And so, they are diving, headlong into this. They're doing the same thing with putting digital weapon systems onto their soldiers with heads-up displays.
Did we lose Lee?
I think perhaps we did.
Yeah, he was talking last week about the Russians acquiring all these new icebreakers, and I don't remember how many icebreakers there were. Do you, Leah?
I do not remember.
13.
Lee, are you back?
Yes, I am. Sorry about that.
Okay.
There were 13 icebreakers that the Russians had. But
so they're clearly way more prepared than we are.
Absolutely, and they are continuing to stay, like I said, headlong into this for vehicles, for aircraft, for operating on improvised runways like dirt roads. I mean, every single aircraft that the Russians have in their military is designed, as far as a jet or basically jets or anything that they fly over there, as far as a fixed wing aircraft. Everything is designed to operate from a dirt strip with mud puddles in it, so as that as a jet runs down that muddy runway, and I'm talking, their most advanced fighter jet, because if you ever look at one of their fighter jets, their front landing gear is always way back, and that's so is that it doesn't splash mud and dirt up into the intakes on the bottom of their jet. So, I mean, everything that they are doing now is now pointed at cold weather. You see no research into hot weather, no research into global warming, no research into, weather modification as far as, to make it warmer or whatever, or cooler. It's all in the cold stuff for, combat and getting their troops around in the cold. And then all of the greenhouses that they've been building, and the additional icebreakers. All of the other countries in the world are not producing as many icebreakers as Russia is. So
right. Now, do you think that this is a defensive response, or are they planning an offensive attack when the rest of the world is weakened?
Yes, both. I think that Putin knows that he doesn't have a whole lot of money. And I think that Putin knows that from, when they fought the Germans, that, there's good things to attacking in mass with cheap production. It's like my buddy Yuri used to say, it don't got to be pretty, it's just got to work. And so, he's building these vehicles at a very low cost, very low tech, impervious to EMPs, CMEs, things of that nature. And, the thing about Russian diesel motors are they smoke even when they're brand new. So it doesn't matter if you're pouring diesel fuel or some other type of fuel. Their diesel engines are designed to run on multi-fuel. So, you can add a little bit of gasoline to motor oil and it'll take off down the road. Or, I've heard stories of people pouring liquor in them and seeing, blue flame coming out of the exhaust pipes. So, there's a variety. Everything they're doing is robust. And as far as, people in the United States preparing, we need to do the same thing. You need to have robust, solid stuff that's going to last a long, long time. Don't buy cheap knockoff stuff. If you're going to buy something, buy quality, and and look at the things that you use on a daily basis and things that you need, and those are the things that you need to stock up on. I hear the story, oh, we don't have a lot of money. Well, buy in bulk and buy dried goods. They're much, much, much cheaper, and skip one movie night and you got supplies for a month. You know what I mean? So there's a lot that we can all do.
One of these Doomsday camps, which is in our area, reached out to us. It's called Fortitude Ranch. Have you heard of Fortitude Ranch?
No, sir. I'm not familiar with that particular facility.
It's a survival community equipped to survive any type of disaster, long-term loss of law and order, managed by a full-time staff, and it's for regular people. So that's why they reached out to us, because we were talking about all the elites already securing their $1 million bunkers. But this is a survivalist ranch, and for about $1,000 per person per year, you become a member. And then if the, SHTF occurs, you just head out to the ranch, and your site is secured. So it's a bug-out location, and in the interim, you can go on vacations there that you obviously have to pay more money for, where they do survivalist training, firing weapons, building structures, lighting fires, growing food, things like that. It's a pretty awesome thing, and for $1,000 per person per year, it's something that someone in a city can actually start thinking about. If you can't buy your own 3-acre piece of land out in the country, this is a much more affordable way to have a place to go. What are your thoughts on these more affordable Doomsday ranches?
Oh, I think that, as long as they have, adequate supplies, adequate power, adequate water, and all of the infrastructure that you're going to need, and then everyone that it's involved in that knows each other, and you're not going to have a bunch of disruptive people, or not a, how should we say, a dignified chain of command within the structure. As long as all of that is established, I've got no problem with any of those type of organizations or groups. The one where I have a concern with that is that you have a person that goes in and purchases, and now that you've said that and talked about it, I have heard of that facility. I saw a video on it not too long ago, and I'd like to see what they have there.
Yeah, me
Part
as well.
that concerns me about that is, so you build a large facility, and you have all of these people that don't know each other, and it hits the fan, and then now you've got 500 people that don't know each other, don't know anything about each other, and nobody's in charge. There is no plan. Some people have supplies, some people don't, and then it's just a madhouse. And so it has to be a tight-knit community of close friends prior to it hitting the fan, because under an extremely stressful situation is not the time to be determining who decides what, and these people are out of food and these people aren't. So all of that needs to be established well in advance.
Yeah, a doomsday hotel sounds like a nightmare.
Right. It does.
Yeah.
And, it brings to mind, too, the importance. I feel like there's a huge benefit in being involved in your own survival plan that you have actively put together. If you're somebody that goes to a place like Fortitude Ranch with the idea that you're somehow going to be at least partially taken care of, well, yeah, if it gets ugly there, it's going to get real ugly real fast.
Yeah, I bet you the unrest within the camp itself would be unimaginable, because the same thing on a small scale would happen there as would happen in the real world. Panic, disorder, and mental instability. So I don't know how they're actually going to make that work successfully, but I'm not going to prejudge it. I haven't read all of their protocols, etc. I think they're working it out now, which is why they reached out to us, because they want to see what we're doing. Where in the
right.
case of what we're doing,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. As long as there's established order, everybody has supplies. It's a community thing. Everybody works together. You've got seeds. You can go forward. You know what I'm saying, and deal with the situation as it transpires. As long as that is established, I've got no problem with any of those. In fact, I have friends that are, how should we say, part of that community. Not particularly that location, but in Arizona. And so, but they live in habitat, and cohabitate each day. So it's when it hits the fan, it's not really a difference to them, because Bill, their neighbor, has been Bill, their neighbor, for 6 years. So it's a little different when you're dealing with somebody that you've known for years, as opposed to, the guy showed up last night in the middle of the night after getting out of, his little version of Armageddon, and the guy next to him, showed up the day before. So that's going to be a little different scenario. So if, I would encourage, a monthly meeting and group gatherings and a cookout and work days and all kinds of other things to get people together and establish a pecking order. Otherwise, it's going to be like throwing a bunch of, wild dogs in a pen to see who's the alpha male. So.
Yeah, now, according to their website, it's run by ex-military officials, so that the core staff is the one that takes care of your ass, and you just go there. So in that kind of scenario, I think it might be able to work, as long as you don't have any vigilantes. But if a vigilante wanted to join the core group, I'm sure they would allow them. Now, on their site, they talk about the probability of a collapse occurring, and they have this calculation calculator, 21% probability of a collapse within the next 12 months, 33% in the next decade. Would you agree with those numbers, Lee?
No. Mine would be much higher over the next decade.
I'll give them the 21% this year, but I think for the next decade, it's probably much above 70%.
Well, actually, I wouldn't give them the 21 this year. We're not that far along. I would actually go lower this year. I would go like maybe a 10% this year.
Yeah.
And then I would do, a 20, a 50, and up from there, over the next, 3 to 5 years. So, and if as long as they run the facility, and I'll give you a prime example. There's an underground facility in West Virginia at the Greenbrier Hotel. And that facility was set up for Congress. And there used to be trains that sat underneath Washington, D.C. all the time. So was that if anything ever hit the fan in D.C., they could take congressmen and senators and other officials and put them on the train and quickly run them over to
Mount Weather.
No, different. Mount Weather's a different facility.
Oh, but also for that same purpose in West Virginia.
Right. Well, actually,
Okay.
yeah. So, and Mount Weather is right outside of Winchester, where FEMA's headquarters is. It's on the mountain right up there, just north of Paris. But anyway, the facility in West Virginia at the Greenbrier, if you remember the accident with the congressman and so on and so forth on it, the Amtrak train hitting the trash truck a few weeks ago, they were actually on their way there, taking the exact same route that the congressman and so on and so forth would take in the event of a disaster. But that is a complete hotel facility. They take care of everything, and it's as a hotel. And if you have security, if you have the capability to, deal with the people know that you have rules, regulations, and consequences for, breaking the rules. As long as all of that is established and everyone is treated equally, and you're providing all of the food, the water, and the sewage treatment, and so on and so forth, I think that the hotel idea is great. But for people just to show up and not have all of those amenities included and have that a structure already established, I think is a recipe for a disaster.
Now, Lee, have you heard in the mainstream that there are plasma scientists predicting that cycle 25 has already begun and we've already seen sunspots from cycle 25?
Yes, and I haven't laughed so hard in a long time.
I mean, what is going on? This is complete nonsense. Anyone that has an associate's degree in science can read about plasma physics. They can read about sunspot cycles, and they can know that we are not at the minimum yet. Therefore, 25 can't begin.
Well, they have to say that because their model says that the sunspot cycle has to begin in the next 45 days. So,
so they're celebrating
they're looking for anything at all that even looks like it that says, "Oh yes, our model is correct."
What?
The problem is that it has to be the majority of the sunspots, and in the other hemisphere, and anytime you have a grand minimum like we're going into, the cycles are actually normally longer. In fact, they'll stretch out to be as long as 14 years.
Yeah, cycle 12 and 11, there were 12 and 13 years.
Yeah, so, they'll stretch out like that. And then the second half of the cycle is always a year or two longer than the first half. So if you just look at the middle of the cycle and say, well, how long did that take? Well, then add a year or two or 18 months and ta-da, you're about there. And this one is, dying like a rock. I mean, I have never seen, of all the models I've got as far as, how the sunspot fall off and, contract. Because when I look at sunspots and look back in history at sunspot history and look at, back in the day when they said, oh, we see 5 sunspots, during the monominimum or what have you. 5 sunspots to them is like 75 to us today, if you look at the way NASA calculates them. Because a single sunspot, depending upon how, or a speck of a sunspot with a friend that shows up is like 15 to 17 to them. So, the numbers of what they were back in the day would be astronomical today. And, for them to say, yes, we had 5 back then, we are way lower than that now. Because a lot of what we call a sunspot now and the way we average and all this other stuff makes the number extremely inflated from what it really is. So, that's the point that I always try to drive home. If they said, oh, yeah, they saw 5 sunspots back then, those were 5 pretty good sized sunspots because, they weren't looking at it with a Alpha 1 telescope. They were looking at it with some, grainy, bubbly glass.
Yeah, I wonder too if, saying that, cycle 25 has already begun, I wonder if that is a ruse in a way to say, oh, look, we've hit minimum and it's no big deal, in the mass media, that is, right? A couple of months ago, we were seeing a lot of media reports about talking about how, when volcanoes go off, it'll drop the temperature, but then it's over in a few years, which I interpreted as another way to try to prevent public panic and distract from grand solar minimum at all. So I have to wonder if kind of pushing that narrative forward is part of that.
The only problem with that is at this same time next year, the sun is going to have been at 0 sunspots for months. And so there's no way around it.
Yeah.
Those people's careers are done. The guy who reported it first, who actually is a well-known solar physicist, he said that the peak for cycle 24 was going to be in 2012. Now we know that it really peaked. Its major peak was in 2014, so he was off by 2 years last cycle.
Right, and again, he's trying to push the models that they have came up with on how this works, and they've left out some things, and I'm not going to go into all that on this show. But when you look at what the magnetic fields are going to do and how low the magnetic field of the surface of the sun is going to go, and you realize that it takes 3,000 gals of magnetism to create a sunspot, and then you look at the sun like it is today. I mean, my God, to think years ago I would see a small coronal hole and it was just a little speck, and now there are these gaping massive things that take up almost half of the face of the sun as they go across, and to think of all of the cosmic rays that are just pouring out of those onto the planet. So it's a You see all of this happening. You see it all changing in the atmosphere every day. You see the cloud nucleation. You can see it as it comes through, like the picture that was on Twitter of what looks like a highly charged, Birkeland current, even has a twist in it that was coming across with the stripes of the magnetic field of the Earth, or the Earth's magnetosphere, was energized underneath of it, and it looked like a picket fence. Going along with a Birkeland current going over top of it. Yeah, the energy flowing through that Birkeland current is shedding some off of the sides because it's all highly energized. It's emitting, and where it comes in and interacts with the magnetic field lines of the planet, the magnetosphere, that's the picket rails. You can actually see the magnetic field lines in the sky. That's what that picket fence is. And because of the close proximity to the Birkeland current, which is what I'm going to call that, people want to call it Steve, and people want to call it SET. Okay, it's a Birkeland current. Okay, that is energy transferring from one place to another as a current, and energy is flowing through it. So it's not a magnetic field line, and it's transferring energy. So to me, that is a Birkeland current by my definition. If somebody, they want to call it all these other things, but they're slicing hairs as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, so it's Steve. Now let's throw these guys under the bus a little bit more. You read a little further on the guy's paper, and he does a prediction for cycle 25. He puts it 40% greater magnitude than cycle 24, which no one in the mainstream is predicting, which makes the guy even more insane. I just got back from observing the frontier, and Dr. Lisa Upton was there, and she's in one of the top 5 plasma physicists in the world in the mainstream, and even she said that 25 is going to be at least 30% diminished from 24. Now, so right. She's at least going the right direction. When these guys are predicting 25 starting now already and being stronger than 24, they have there's nothing to back that up, especially with the work of Zarkova, the heartbeat of the sun, the double dynamo, and on and on. And what we're actually observing occurring. Even the NOAA sunspot forecast has the sun continuing to diminish and wane for 2 more years. So they're not even calling the beginning of cycle 25 until at least 2020.
Yeah, and
yeah.
When you look at the diminishment of sunspot activity as we go into minimums after the second peak is higher than the first peak, which is key. That's Jack Eddy's work and John Casey's work. When you look at the diminishment after that, and going back through all of the solar cycles, each time this transpires, you'll see that there is always a minimum of at least a 30% decay in the number of sunspots per cycle thereafter until the final minimum is reached. And you'll have at least 1 or 2 cycles in the bottom of that minimum that are low before it even starts to come back up. So and because you've got those extremely low sunspot counts, which make extremely long cycles, where you would say, okay, and if they're 11-year cycles, in 30 years I'd have 3 cycles. But when they're extremely long cycles going out to like 14 years, you've got now 28 years and just 2 cycles. You see where I'm coming from? Plus, it's that when you're down there, it's a lot colder, because what people don't realize is sunspots on the sun are kind of like jet engines running in full afterburner. You see the flame blowing out of the back of it, but it's darker up inside the engine. You know what I'm saying? And that's because there's so much energy blowing out of the back that it's burning in the back. It's still burning on the inside too, but you see the flame really blowing out, and that gives us a little more heat. So when you go through those longer sunspot cycles that are at much diminished counts, we're going to be missing that afterburner heat from each one of those sunspots, and that's going to make a big difference. And then the coronal holes that are getting monstrous. I'm still flabbergasted by the rate of which the size that they're growing. But when you look at the fact that the solar wind speed's coming down and the energy coming out from the sun is coming down and everything's falling off like a rock, you can expect for it to start to be cooling down. I look at it as like an ember in a fire. It's been a raging fire for 176 years, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it's starting to cool down, and you're starting to see the embers glow and getting cooler and cooler, and you can physically see it getting cooler. You can look at the sun and see the coronal holes, which are cooler spots. They're not like inside the sunspots. Their coronal holes are cool spots. And when you look at all of the different spectrums of energy through the SDO, the Solar Dynamic Observatory, if you look at the high-end temperatures, you'll notice that they've diminished to almost nothing. And the only spectrum that looks like it's getting any stronger is the lowest temperatures. So more of the sun is at lower temperatures, and less of the sun, and a whole lot less of the sun is at higher
last week we
temperatures.
had a coronal hole. It was an equatorial hole that was very well defined, and people that are new to watching the sun could actually see that hole quite clearly, that thin equatorial hole. What's facing Earth now, and we're just coupling with the new coronal hole that's turned around the limb, is it's the whole sun. The coronal hole is the size of the whole sun. It's not a defined hole, but the entire sun looks like out. And a spot that just turned around the limb into this region completely shut off as it faced Earth. So the Earth-facing side of the sun is definitely cooler than the other sides of the sun, and it's a phenomenon that we're just starting to understand. Now, granted, we're in this electrical circuit with all the planets and all their rotations, so that when we face the giant magnet, that's going to be the greatest effect. Can you extrapolate on that diminishment of cycles as they turn around during this Earth-facing calm, as they call it, as we dive into the grand minimum?
Well, the biggest concern I have as we're going into this minimum is the 4 magnetic fields in the sun are going out of phase with each other, and as they fight to go out of phase with each other, along the edges you'll get these little whirlpools of magnetic energy that are referred to as regions of magnetic instability. And it's those little whirlpools or regions of magnetic instability that are going to cause Carrington events and things of that nature. So it's going to be ugly going into the solar minimum and ugly coming out of the solar minimum because our likelihood of having substantial events like the one we just had with 2673, those type events are going to become more prevalent. And as our magnetosphere, and this is the worst part about it, as our magnetosphere decreases in its strength, it decreases in its ability to protect us from flares and events that take place on the sun, space weather. So small flares and CMEs that used to affect the planet very minorly are now having a much more substantial effect on the planet, electrical grids and things of that nature, by magnitudes of X. So it's a substantial increased danger even with the same threat. But the fact that the threat is increasing means the danger is, 10, 20, 100-fold greater because of the size of the threat is growing and the protection that we have from the threat is diminishing. So there will be problems in the future, undoubtedly somewhere on this planet, if not the whole thing.
Yeah, and these grid down scenarios, as the magnetosphere is waning, are going to only get worse. And the reason, you just explained it. Because let's say a whole section of the grid is fried on a portion of the planet in a decade, and the magnetosphere has waned so weak that anything additional coming off the sun is going to do the same amount of damage. So we're not going to replace the infrastructure with the same type of grid. That's impossible. We would have to develop a whole new type of grid that could prevent that type of failure, which is not going to happen anytime soon after the grid fails. So we're talking decades of no more grid. And I don't think a lot of people realize this. And the cosmic ray flux and the waning magnetosphere aren't going to get better anytime soon. We're talking multi-decadal. Even if the pole flip occurs in 2040, it has to then go back. So it's decades in and decades out. Now, a lot of people are arguing about when does the grand solar minimum start. And there's no way to really say that, in my point of view, until we're well into it and we can all decide when it started. It's very clear that we're descending into it. And I did some research into the recent literature, and the people that are calling for long-term grand minima, which is the 1,000-year cycle, are stating that the solar grand minima will start sometime in 2050 and last past 2200. And there's another camp that thinks that this is just going to be a multi-decadal minor perturbation, a minor minima like the Dalton or the Centennial, which will only last until about 2050. Now, I believe that the grand minima is going to start next cycle or the cycle after it and last for hundreds of years. What are your thoughts, Lee?
Well, technically, the solar grand solar minimum has already started, and the day that started was the day that the second peak of solar cycle 24 was higher than the first peak, because that is the first signature of a grand minima. So if it's the marker.
Right,
that is the marker.
That's when we knew.
Right. And so when that happened, I'm with Casey here. It started. This is the starting point. So to me, it already started. And so that is what all of my models were based on, was the day. And so that's why I've been so accurate in my predictions through today, was because we wrote all of our predictions back then, and they were all based on the models that we'd established then, of that being the start. And so now here we are, 2018, winter crops are lost, summer crops are lost, snow in April, snow totals being broken, cold weather temperatures being broken. Down here in Tampa, they broke the record from 1959. They had freezing in St. Petersburg, Florida. So that's on the coast. It's not like in the middle of the state. So the temperatures that we are now experiencing, and that was January the 18th of this year.
You had record manatee kills down there this year. They had to save sea turtles and on and on. It was insane.
Right. And so, so it has begun. People can say, this is a solar cycle, and, this was the low and it was a minimal, and of the next 2-3 cycles that we go through. But technically, we already started. And so, that is where we are. We are in the very infancy of this. And I was talking to a guy the other day about this out of New York. And, he said, well, Lee, how far into it are we? And I said, well, if you were taking a trip across the United States, you just walked out your front door of your house and you're fumbling for your keys.
Yeah, you're getting in the car.
Right. We've got a long way to go. And we didn't
even take the first piss break.
Right. We haven't gotten in the car yet. We're still looking for the keys. And so, we're still rounding up the dog. So this is a long, long, long road ahead of us. It will progressively get worse each year. There will be years that will be devastating to northern regions as far as not having power, not having supplies, not being able to get through by the highways, airports closed, basically, similar to, what they had in Buffalo years ago when it shut down Buffalo. But it's going to be worse this time because back in the day, they didn't have 7-Elevens and everybody, had more than 2 or 3 days worth of food in their home. So, it's going to be a lot worse, this time around. And this time around, it's going to keep coming. And, it's going to be year after year after year. And it's going to get worse and worse and worse each year. So, I have friends that own corporations, on the U.S.-Canadian border that, I want to talk to about, hey, guys, you need to change this and, deal with this. Because the load that is going to be required to be filled by the heaters, the block heaters in cars, industry trying to keep their facilities going, and so on and so forth, there's not enough overhead in the grid to handle that. And, you were talking about the electromagnetic storms taking down the grid. It only takes 2 volts per kilometer to take down the grid, but an electromagnetic field, EMP, CME, what have you, from the sun can induce as much as 10 volts per kilometer. And Dr. Scove was saying the other day that, they're now implementing breaks in the lines, but I don't think that's going to be the complete answer. I mean, I recommended that years ago, and I'm glad to hear that, people are doing it, whether they listen to my recommendation or somebody else's, they're still making it happen, which I think is a great thing. But there are still issues of while the storm is going on, the grid will be down. So, it doesn't matter if the storm takes the grid out or if, they take the grid, they shut it off. Either way, you're without heat. So if you're, in extreme northern climates in the middle of the winter time, you're can be without heat for, a substantial period of time, 12 hours, what have you. And then they'll turn it back on provided there was no damage to the grid while the event was taking place. So, these events are going to become more prevalent. We're going to see more problems with the grid with lightning also. That's going to be a growing problem in the future that we're going to have to contend with as well. And it will be much more devastating. We're already seeing the increased size in the lightning bolts, the number of lightning bolts, the devastation from those bolts. So there's a lot of changes coming along that people haven't even begun to see. And, seeing Steve in the sky is nothing compared to what we'll be seeing in the coming years.
Right, because in the last decade, we've begun photographing blue jets and sprites leaving Earth in higher and higher frequency. This is positive ground to space, lithospheric, ionospheric lightning that goes all the way up into space. Steve is a version of that, but that's more of a static, connected Birkeland current as opposed to these blue jets or sprites, which are massive. They're like 1 million times the scale of a negative strike down in the upward portion. And based on the construction of dolums, historical information, ancient cultures worldwide, these electrical events have happened in recent history and are going to happen again. And now that we have the modern science, we should be warning the public of what's happening. There are already more lightning strikes worldwide. We've been reporting on them, deaths of dozens of people at a time from single strikes, as well as animals. We just had a lightning strike that dropped, I don't know how many geese in the U.S., but I just reported on it the other day. They're calling these all freak lightning. Well, once you have 59 freak lightning events in 4 months, someone's got to say, stop the nonsense.
Right, absolutely.
Leah, you have anything to share?
Well, I'm thinking a lot about, grid down situations. And, we talked a little bit about, Russian preparation for GSM. And, other than some of these grid down practice runs, which I'm not even quite clear that actually does anything for anyone, but it makes me wonder, what is the United States government doing to prepare for any of this? I have no idea.
You have any insights, Lee?
Well, the U.S. government had several studies done. DHS did one. There was a group of power companies, the major power companies all over the United States, that did another study. Dr. Scove, with the groups that she works with space weather, they look at what the sun can do and write predictions of, basically they identify what the threat is and what the threat can be and what they should be prepared for, and then try to convince these power companies that have investors that want to make money to spend money on some type of something that comes from the sun that hasn't happened since 1859, and so they've got to get it past their beam counters.
Argument to tell.
Okay, so it's been really difficult to get the power companies to come on board. And a couple years ago, when I was talking about this, and there was an event that came along, and a couple grids went down here and there. I made comments about it then. And then we had the one, I think it was about a year or so ago, where they lost power in California and all over the United States from another solar event, even lost power down here at an amusement park in Florida and places in the Northeast. But anyway, the following week, there were power outages all over California, Southern California, because Pepco, I think it is out there, or whatever it is on the West Coast, or Pacific Gas and Electric. They were out installing disconnects all over the place to prevent the energy from a CME from coming in on their lines. So I was very excited to see that one of the power companies was going after it, because they had just lost, several million people had lost power. And so they realized, yeah, we need to do this, and we need to do this now. Talking about it is over with. We need to act. And so I was happy with what they had done. And then Dr. Scove had talked about some other power companies were putting in disconnects all over the United States. But they have ran these scenarios and seen what it will do. And they are implementing some structural modifications within the electrical system itself, as far as higher voltage disconnects and disconnects more frequently on long distance transmission lines. So instead of having a transmission line that runs out across the desert and has, it's 200 miles long with disconnects only on the ends, they're putting multiple disconnects in between that. But still you have the issue of transformers themselves being able to have this energy induce into those. There's nothing that you can do about that. And you still have the problem with, if there is a high voltage induced onto the transmission lines themselves, that high voltage can actually arc across the disconnect and cause damage through everything without the system actually being online. So there's lots of, how should we say, possible things that can go wrong, even with the best laid plans of how to defend against it. And you talked about, coming back online after an event like this. Well, I don't see us coming back. If you had a significant event like the Carrington event, I think so much, or, just even a tenth of what we just had with, 2673. If you had an event like that and it would take down transformers, the grid, communications, and a wide variety of other things, you have to look at the fact that large transformers, and I'm talking about the really big ones, those transformers, take up to 3 years to be built, and that's under normal circumstances. So if you can't transport it because you have no fuel to put in the truck, you have no electricity to call the guy that makes them, and by the way, he doesn't have any electricity either. How is he going to make that and ship that to you? And oh, by the way, they're 3 years under normal circumstances. Now you and everybody else in the world wants one. So call us back in 30 years. We'll see if we can have one for you. So,
plus, we have 9,000 miles of high tension wire all fried.
Right.
And and it takes 7 months just to put the fires out after the event. So there's going to be a huge taxing of the infrastructure. And we're going to be going to break now. And when we get back, Lee's going to tell us how to make our own personal Faraday cage, improvised explosive device, and potato gun. So stay tuned, because there's a lot to talk about on the Inconvenient Truth, prepping for the grand solar minimum.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
Join me weekdays for my new show, Tell Chris Joe. It's going to be a problem show brought to you live from Kensington. Thursdays, I'm dealing with hot topics, heated debate, what's new around the world, and ring-ins to discuss listeners' problems and offering considered and heartfelt solutions. So join me, Chris Hart, for Tell Chris Joe. Stop what you're doing, grab a cup of tea. I'm coming live from Kensington. Relax. Let me entertain you with a coffee bar online. Listeners' very personal problems. So that's Thursdays, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. See you there. It's going to be lots of fun.
This is Barbara DeLong, host of Nightlight Radio, inviting you to join me on a cosmic journey, exploring a metaphysical montage of spiritual material, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between, including spiritual readings for those who seek enlightenment. Let Nightlight provide you with equal measure of light, love and laughter, insight, wisdom, and inspiration. Monday nights, 10 to 12 p.m. Eastern, right here on Studio B, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Good evening, folks. This is Diamond with the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, bringing you the second hour of The Inconvenient Truth with our returning guest, Lee Wheelbarger and Leah Shaper. We were just discussing some of the finer points of the grand solar minimum as we descend into it. As Lee pointed out, it began during cycle 24 back in 2015 after that double peak was noticed by many of us who had been watching the sun for years. That set off a frenzy of work because we knew what was coming. Now, with the work of John Casey, many people were first warned about what is happening. And John Casey's work basically discusses an increase in volcanic activity during these events. He uses historical documents and his relational cycle, which is a 200-year grand solar minimum cycle, 206-year, I believe. And he correlates major earthquakes and volcanic activity worldwide to these events. Now, we're talking about North America. Specifically, we're talking about the New Madrid. We were just talking about the difficulty in fixing infrastructure like the grid if a major geomagnetic storm were to destroy it on Earth, because the geomagnetic storms that will follow will only be worse, and it would take a very long time, just as Lee said, to replace a single massive
Transformers.
Yeah, transformers at one of those main stations. So in the case of a major earthquake like New Madrid, it faulted at 7.4 first, and around 6 months later it faulted at 8.2. So if a major earthquake at New Madrid were to sever all thousands of pipelines of toxic waste, dumping into the Mississippi, breaking apart all the bridges and infrastructure, and people went back to those areas to fix them, they would all die when a second aftershock hit shortly thereafter, which is one of the things he warns about in his book. So the times ahead are going to be unprecedented, and the amazing thing is, with the amount of technology we have, somewhere we're going to be covering this information as it unfolds. Lee, do you have any idea of, let's say there's a grid down situation, can the satellite still be working? And if I'm off grid and I'm a ham operator, will I be able to link up, and will we be able to make our own global communication system in a total grid down situation?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have people who are preppers, who are hams. You have government facilities that have radio systems that are hardened. And then you have the Russians who are still building their radios with tubes in them, like from the 50s, that are pretty much impervious to EMP type events or CME type events. So the Russians will still be on the air. The Chinese will still be on the air. Some U.S. military facilities will still be on the air. Lots of amateur radio operators will still be on the air. And they will be able to communicate through something known as MARS, which is Military Amateur Radio Service. And then there's also, amongst the government entities without satellite communications, there's what's called SHARES program, which I was part of through CCOM, Communications and Electronics Command. And the SHARES is an HF communications system that allows the American Red Cross to communicate with the FBI, to communicate with the State Department. And so all federal government agencies that are law enforcement or provide services to the general public and that includes the American Red Cross, which is actually not a government entity, but acts as one and has the authority of one. But they are all part of that shares network, and they will be on the air. So there will be, people who are on the air and people with radios that they have protected that weren't hardened, but they protected them in things like Faraday cages. And a Faraday cage is a structure that is normally made of a very, very thin, fine copper screen. And it has doors that seal when you close them, so as that all of the edges are overlapping, so as that no RF energy, radio frequency energy, can get into that cage. And so if you were talking on your cell phone, or you were, doing something of that nature with a two-way radio or a pager or whatever, and you go into a Faraday cage, when they close the door behind you or you close the door, your cell phone will cut off and you will not get any pages on your pager, and nothing will work inside that cage, because all electromagnetic energy, which is what a radio signal is, all of those energy waves are being captured by the cage around you and being basically shorted out and not being allowed to pass through that. And that's because of how small the holes are within the screen. Now, small Faraday cages, you can build your own. You can pay millions of dollars for a large one to have it contracted for you if you want one like what the government has. But there are simple things that you yourself can do to have a Faraday cage. The quickest, easiest, and simplest Faraday cage in the world is a microwave oven. Cut the cord off of it, throw your two-way radios and your battery chargers in the microwave, close the door, and don't worry about it. We know that works because a microwave is designed to prevent the RF energy inside that cooks the food from coming out and cooking you. So because it prevents that energy from coming out, it also prevents energy from the outside from coming in. So that is a simple Faraday cage. A metal trash can, galvanized trash can with tape around it that has foil tape, like for ductwork for HVAC systems. The metal ammo cans. If you put aluminum foil inside, if you open the ammo can up that flips open, you pull this foam around the lid out, you wrap aluminum foil around that foam, and then put it back in, grind, to get all the paint and glue and everything off, so it's a good electrical contact. Do the same thing around the inside of the top of the container where it closes. You can throw some radios, battery chargers, so on and so forth in that. I recommend all 12-volt battery chargers. So when you go to buy rechargeable batteries, get the highest capacity battery you can get, and get a 12-volt recharger and put all of that in that container, your batteries and your battery charger. That way when you pick that up and you've got it written on the side of it, batteries, in black magic marker or tape or however you decide to mark your stuff, it's all protected in there. You take it out, you use it, you put it back in. That way it's always protected. So, that's basics on Faraday cages. A large Faraday cage, if you want to put one in your house for other goods and so on and so forth, take a room that doesn't have any windows, preferably, and just simply staple to the walls copper screen. And when you get to the edges of the screen, you fold it over at least twice, staple it to the wall, and then go along with a soldering iron and solder those two pieces of copper screen together periodically, going down around it. And then where the door comes in, you have to have screen. And what I would do in that room is I would build a Faraday cage in the room and have a door coming into it, so as it's separate from the door coming out of the room, and have the Faraday cage take up, say, 3/4 of that room, and then have a screen door that has a lip that goes around the outside of it that has screen pushed in behind it, so as that when the door closes, that screen is making good contact with the screen on the inside, or the screen that is the wall that the door is closing against. Because if any signal can come inside that room, anything that's in that room that is not in a smaller Faraday cage will get fried, because it only has to have a crack. So if there's a crack as big as a credit card, the signal can come through. There can't be any cracks anywhere.
Yeah, I used to make these giant testing rooms for military defense contractors to test equipment, and it's like a reverse Faraday cage where they were testing the EMF coming off of a new piece of equipment they're making, and they would put it in these rooms, which we would the copper door that I would install in these rooms weighed like 3,000 pounds, with all kind of a pressure plate on all on the sides, exactly as you explained. But what we were hanging inside for EMF capture was ferrite plates, which you can source from China. We would get, crates of them and screw them up one next to each other inside just a plywood box. But there couldn't be a 1/16 of an inch gap, or you would get a wave in or out. So the key is taping all the seams, double folding and stapling. But if you're ferro, you can get a pretty good cage the way you described, Lee.
Yeah, there are several people. There's actually a doctor that I follow on YouTube who is an RF specialist, and I used to work in EMP. I was if anybody's familiar with the Pulse Power building at CCOM, where they simulated EMPs inside of a building, I worked in that building. So when it comes to EMPs and Faraday cages and protection and so on and so forth, you had to be pretty well versed to get a job there. But there's a guy who makes homemade Faraday cages and does these tests, and everything that I recommend as far as how to do things and how well it will work, and this works and this doesn't, have all been tested by people with PhDs in RF engineering and using multi-$1,000 pieces of equipment to check the signal strength of the receiver inside. They check the receiver sensitivity prior. They check the sensitivity inside the container. They check different spectrums of energy from low to high, basically DC to daylight, and different dB levels outside of the container to make sure that nothing is penetrating inside of that. That would be a frequency that would be emitted by a CME or an EMP at their appropriate levels. And basically what I'm recommending is good enough that if the EMP from, say, a nuclear warhead were strong enough to get into that container that you've put inside of a Faraday cage, you've got bigger problems than having a roof.
So we know how to build these makeshift Faraday cages. We did a little mini primer on it. What electronics should we be stockpiling and preparing with? We just covered the fact that if you're out there listening, I did a little research. You can get a portable ham radio very affordably in the $200 range of high-quality unit. The only problem is you need a license to operate on the frequencies. So you need to take your amateur ham radio operator's license test, which is at the AARL 7 website. Is that correctly?
Yeah, the ARRL, the American Amateur Radio Relay League, or the Amateur Radio Relay League.
Now, what about, so I recommend the Crank weather radios, which gives you weather band. That there may be some broadcasting on that, as well as the CB. And any Crank radio is just something awesome to have because you can always power it up. Because when we were ending the last show, you were talking about literally powering up your entire solar system with a 10-speed bike and some sort of alternator. Can you extrapolate on those ideas? And maybe more about the radios that we should be purchasing?
Yeah, so we'll get into the radios first. So you've got different spectrums, radio spectrums. So HF, which is high frequency, that's like around CB or 10 meter or what have you. And you were talking about everybody getting, a ham license. I highly recommend everyone to get a ham license so as that you learn how radio propagation works. You learn about the ionosphere. You learn about electronics. You learn how to make antennas. It's all great skills to have. So I highly recommend everyone to do that and, try to be a technician class at least. But anyway, so you have HF radios. Those are your CBs, your low band, long antennas, those radios are great for talking long distances or talking around the world, depending upon the conditions. Now, as the solar flux is coming down from the sun, it makes it harder to talk around the world, but you can still get some pretty good long haul communications out of that. And you can still hear communications from around the world on an HF antenna. And the secret of an antenna is the bigger the antenna, the better. Because the more metal that you have in the sky, the more surface area that you have to gather that signal. And so, people used to, make fun of me because people had an element that would stick up in the air that's, a quarter wavelength or whatever of that frequency. But I would take a piece of copper pipe, cut it the exact same length, solder it on the end of the connector, and I'd talk twice as far, hear twice as good. People couldn't figure out why it's the same length. It's because I got greater surface area. So, there are a lot of tricks that you'll learn as an amateur radio operator. So like I said, I highly recommend it. Now, as far as what people should have in their own personal possession, I recommend a GPS receiver with 3D maps, topographical maps, and so on and so forth in it, because in the event that GPS is still functioning, it's nice to be able to use that. If you can get a receiver that receives both U.S. GPS as well as the Russian GLONASS GPS, then I would recommend to get that, because now you have two systems that you can depend upon, as well as if your receiver will actually receive both of those systems simultaneously, you get a much greater accuracy within the GPS receiver. So that's what I would look for there. As far as a portable radio system and base station radio systems, I don't recommend Bofong or any of these other Chinese ham radios that are coming out, or these D-Stars and all that other stuff. Forget all that. You don't need that. All you need is a good quality, like Yaesu radio or a Vertex standard radio that is a dual band radio. And that when I say dual band, I'm talking about UHF and VHF. Ultra high frequency for the UHF, very high frequency for the VHF. The VHF is 138 to 174 megahertz. The UHF is from 412 to 513. So those two bands are the primary bands that you will most likely contact other people on. And that is because those two bands contain FRS, which is the family radio service, the radios that you buy at Walmart. They also contain the GMRS, General Mobile Radio Service, which is a 462.550, I think is one of their frequencies. That's a UHF, which people use in metropolitan areas. And there is a repeater system that goes along with that will allow a walkie-talkie to talk instead of a few miles up to like 20 or 30 miles by communicating through the repeater system. You can also have that in VHF, but the UHF is preferred through the repeater. So if you're in rural areas, mountains, open lands, you need to talk a good ways. I recommend at least a 50-watt base station with a good, 5 to 7 dB antenna on the roof of the house, good ground plane. 50-watt mobiles in all of the vehicles, and then a good 5 to 7 watt portable with a good solid antenna on the portable radios with heavy duty battery packs, and use lithium ions or nickel metal hydride batteries. And you always want to spend the extra money and get a radio that is water resistant and shock resistant. I prefer mil-spec 810 C, D, and E as far as the specifications for dust, shock, and vibration. And that's dropping it on concrete on 3 faces from a meter 3 times, beating the stuffings out of it, and then spraying it with a high-pressure washer and blowing dust over it for long periods of time. And if it lives through that, it'll pretty much live on your belt with no problem. So that's the radio. That's the mil-spec I recommend on the radios, or any equipment that is electronic. Prefer to get mil-spec 810 C, D, and E as far as shock, dust, and vibration. So you get those, the Yaesu or the ICOM or Vertex or somebody that makes a nice solid radio. If you're not spending $200 on that radio, you're not buying a radio. You're buying a piece of junk that is going to fail you when you need it. So, I consider the radio one of your most important assets. I recommend that you get batteries and cycle them and, use the radio, become very familiar with it, have several, have extras, have extra battery chargers, extra batteries, extra antennas, lapel mics, earbuds, things of that nature, so people can talk to you and other people around you won't be able to hear it. Turn off all the lights on the radio so as that if you're operating at night and somebody talks to you or you talk to somebody else, you don't light up like a Christmas tree. As far as the frequencies, MURS, multi-user radio service, which again are VHF frequencies. You would be able to monitor all of the weather frequencies, which are in the 162 megahertz range, through that same radio. So you've got that, the search and rescue frequencies of 155, 205, and the HERE system 155.340. All of those frequencies would be able to be programmed into the radio. The other thing that I recommend is buy all identical radios. So there is no change, this one doesn't work that way. And then the other thing is, if you have a group of people, issue the radio to the person as opposed to just having them be community radios, because studies have been found that radios that are issued to people come back a whole lot better off than commonly shared radios. There's in fact 70% more damage to radios that are from a community share as opposed to I worked for Motorola for a period of time, and that was part of our research for fire departments and law enforcement. And taxi operators are the worst on radios in the world. So if a radio will last in a taxi or a police car, it'll last anywhere. And that's the mil-spec A10 CD and E. As far as other electronics, I recommend that you get as high efficiency solar panels as possible. And you have a lot of the cheaper panels are 15% panels, but the higher efficiency panels are like 20%. And people go, well, Lee, why would I get the 20% panel? It's only 5% more efficient than the 15% panel. Well, no, it's really not. When you look at it, let's say there's 100 watts shining onto the panel. And if you have a 15% panel, you're going to get 15 watts out of it. But if you have a 20% panel, you're going to get 20 watts out of it. The difference between 15 watts and 20 watts is 25%. Basically, yeah.
That's a quarter more energy.
Right. Why would you ever buy a 15% efficient panel when you know that math? And that's how you make, like my solar yacht, me and my wife are building. We have the highest efficiency panels on them, but because you have to for the power demand that we have. But if you're trying to conserve space and you're trying to get the maximum energy from the sun and you're dealing with a cloudy environment, that 20% panel is going to outperform that 15% panel hands down all day long. And on the overcast days, in most cases, it's still going to outperform that panel by more than just the percentage. You will probably end up on the cloudy days and completely overcast days getting twice the power out of the 20 or 21% panel, 22% panel than you will out of the 15. So I highly recommend those types of panels. And then as far as a charge controller behind
those are
panel,
the monocrystalline.
Yes.
Yeah, they don't cost that much more, maybe 18 to 20%.
Not anymore, they don't.
Yeah, and so it's really worth the extra because I've seen the specs. They're good, and they can run 80% in a cloudy day. It's just like the sun's out.
Yes, because it's that much more of an efficient panel. And the performance that you get from them, and the life expectancy on the panel is 25 years.
Yeah,
you say, oh, well, my God, in 25 years, I'm going to have to buy new panels. No, in 25 years, you got another 25 years after that it's going to be dying off.
Yeah, it's going to be around 70% in 25 years, and then 10% every 3 years.
Right.
Yeah, they'll be there for a while.
Right. So, so you do that, and then the behind that, you want a charge controller that is an MPPT. That's multi-power point tracking is what you want to have as far as your charge controller going to your battery banks. And I have my own redneck way of doing this that, people have said you're crazy for doing it that way, Lee, but a lot of people use, higher voltage battery banks. I say 48 volts is the max that you should have. And on the panels, a lot of people go as high as 150 volts or what have you on their panels, or 170 volts on a string. But I don't like doing that. And the reason for that is, let's say you got 4 panels in a string and you're operating at 170 volts or whatever it is. If you have a problem with just a single cell in a single panel in that string, if you lose 10% across that single cell, you lose 10% across that entire string. Now that's significant, because now you've lost 40%. Okay? So I prefer not to do that. I like to have as big a panel as I can get, and then have it up to be like a 56 or a 72 or 76 volt panel. And by having it be a higher voltage panel like that, I'm able to put it in parallel with other panels. And then if I have a problem with a single panel, guess what? I only have a problem with a single panel. It doesn't affect everything else. The other great part about that is let's say it all goes south and 10 years from now you can't buy parts for anything and everybody else in the world is off the grid, and one day my Outback Extreme charge controller, decides to, bite the dust. Well, I got a 48 volt pack, I got a 56 volt panel. When the sun comes up, I'm just going to hook the panel straight to the batteries. I'll sit there and watch the voltage. I don't need a charge controller. I got a redneck sitting there watching the gauge, and that's the other thing, or the voltmeter. And I recommend everybody has analog voltmeters. Go buy analog. Don't buy digital. Yeah. Buy analog.
Now, how will these charge controllers fare in an EMP? Should we disconnect them and throw them in our Faraday cage?
Well, I've got my own redneck tricks for that. What I do is
aluminum foil and Scotch tape.
There you go. Bubble gum and baler wire. And
MacGyver it.
So, in my design, no piece of wire is longer than 30 feet. So basically what I do is I have the solar array on top of the Faraday cage. And then the wires come down to the Faraday cage. And when they come to the edge of the Faraday cage, between the inside and the outside of the Faraday cage, I have a fuse holder. And that fuse is the only, and I don't use a breaker, I use a fuse. Because if the voltage is induced in there, I want that thing to snap immediately. I don't want it to be a slow blow. So I just do that right there, and then that line can be broken there. Then I come inside, and when I get to that comes inside the main Faraday cage, and then because we're using screen as the Faraday cage, the charge controllers are inside of another Faraday cage inside of that. So I have a separate Faraday cage that everything else is inside the building. And then when it comes to the go into that Faraday cage, I have yet another fuse there that comes in, and that's on the backside underneath the book cover and so on and so forth. So I've got everything, and the wire is wrapped in copper. So I'm doing all kinds of things to protect the wire from anything coming in. So that's my trick to get the wires on the inside. I use the fuses, and I have a very small hole for that to come through, and that is actually inside of a box that is a Faraday cage around that. So by using very short wires, they're not really long enough to have much induced into them. And by using the fuses, it blows immediately, and it's not carrying anything inside. And so you have your solar array on the top. It comes into your charge controllers, your extreme charge controllers. And the reason that I like the Outback Extreme charge controller is because it has no moving parts. And it uses a huge heat sink on the outside of it, so it cools itself, and it's sealed. It's basically hermetically sealed, which also helps protect it from an EMP or CME type of event. And also a Apple iPhone. Thus far, of all the testing that I've seen or done, an Apple iPhone has the highest protection to an EMP from any phone that I've seen. So if you need to store something, as far as storing files or records or whatever electronically and to carry with you, even if you don't like an iPhone, just get one to hide your files in, because that is twice as good as any Android phone I've seen so far.
Interesting.
As far as the protection, and it's just, well, when you're paying $600 or $700 or whatever those things are, they have a very good protection in them. So basically, that's what I've got for the Faraday cage and that. What else you got?
So you got your charge controllers in a Faraday cage, which is in a Faraday cage where the batteries are probably at, and you've got redundant systems with two ways to trip. There's a fuse on the outside of the first Faraday cage and a second fuse on the outside of the charge control cage.
Yes. And then
Excellent.
so once it comes into that, all of the electronics are inside of the second Faraday cage. So the charge controllers, the Mate 3, all of that is inside the second Faraday cage, inside the first Faraday cage. And then my batteries are all stacked along the walls on both sides, and the outer Faraday cage is the outer wall of that Faraday cage. And then all I have to do is build a top and a front to the battery boxes, because they're against the wall, and those batteries are inside a Faraday cage, and it feeds out of the Faraday cage that all of the electronics are in, goes through another wall, and then goes into the battery banks, and everything inside of that is in a Faraday cage. And that's how my layout is set up as far as...
It sounds pretty pretty good. Leah, what were you going to say?
This is actually a question, and I'm backtracking a little bit. But so my dad is a casual ham operator, and a while ago I asked him for his advice, and we were talking antennas, and it alerted me to an issue that a lot of people are perhaps not aware of. That there's different kinds of ham antennas, and some of them are good for some things and not for others. And the reason this came up is that we live in an area with very extreme topography. And ultimately, we were trying to go through it, and then he said, the best thing you can do is find a local ham operator, because they want to help you. Go talk to him and ask him what you should get. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about the different kinds of ham antennas.
Sure. So for each frequency range of signals, they're just like speakers for your home stereo. So the lower frequencies have longer antennas, and so HF antennas are really long. CB radios, a quarter wavelength of a CB radio frequency, like channel 19, which is 27.185 megahertz, a quarter wave of that is 106 inches. So because people would have a 102-inch whip plus the 4-inch spring on the bottom of it gives you 106. That's the center of their band. And so an antenna is only good for what's called a band width. And so as you go up, so you have HF antennas, then you have like CB antennas, then you have low band antennas, which are just like 30 megahertz to 54, and then you got 6 meter antennas, and you got which is 54 megahertz to like 72 or whatever it is, and then you've got VHF antennas, which a quarter wavelength of a VHF signal, which is let's say like 150 megahertz or 155 megahertz. A quarter wavelength of that would be around 18 inches. So we've went from 106 inches at 27 megahertz down to only 18 inches at 155 megahertz, and at 460 megahertz it would only be 6 inches long.
So the 8-inch rabbit ears on your TV is your UHF antenna.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So that's and that's because it's about 406 along in there, 402. So that's the difference in the length of the antennas. Now you have a problem, because imagine that signal propagating out of that antenna is like the size of a bullet. So if you have a really low frequency or a subwoofer for your speaker, that's a really big, like, cannonball or a missile or whatever, and that will fire a long ways. Then when you get into low band radio, we'll talk, 100, 150 miles, what have you, if you got high power on a base station in good conditions. A VHF mobile radio with 150 watts and a good antenna on flat ground, we'll talk about 30 to 40 miles. If you've got, good propagation or open terrain in VHF. In UHF, with a 40-watt radio and a good mobile antenna, you'll be lucky to talk 5 to 10 miles. And then if you were operating in 800 megahertz, which I do not recommend for anybody, you would only be able to talk a couple miles with like 30 watts because it doesn't penetrate as well. It doesn't go through the foliage. So when you're in an open environment, something in VHF is best, but when you get into a metropolitan area in a big city or buildings and things of that nature, you're a lot better off with UHF 460 megahertz because it propagates and bounces off the walls, and you get what's called multipath, which is where the signal will come out and bounce off a building and go around the corner or go down through a stairwell or what have you. So that's the advantage of a UHF, because I mean it's crazy because you can have two radios go out in the open area and the VHF will talk a long ways, but you bring the VHF in the city and somebody goes into a building and you can't talk to them on the backside of the building. They're only 200 yards away, but the UHF will talk right through there, but yet it won't talk 2 miles out in the open country. So depending upon your environment, depends upon what you need. And I recommend waterproof stuff, ruggedized stuff, put a mil spec on it, get extra fuses, and so on and so forth for all of the radios. And then as far as, pumps, everything that you get that you're going to hook to all of this stuff, as far as the inverters, now we've went into the batteries. So as far as the inverters are concerned, I do redundancy of all inverters. So if it's a 110 volt system for like in a camper, fine. I put two out back 1224s, I think what they are, 12 volt, 24 volt, or 12 volt, 2600 watt or whatever it is. So it's a 2612 or whatever the model number it is. I've forgotten it right now. But anyway, you put two out back. If it's 110 volts, you put two out back inverters in parallel, and you slave the two together in parallel so as that you have a huge surge capability to start an air conditioner or whatever you want. It's not stressing the inverters, and either of those inverters will handle the load. But if you have a failure of one, the system stays online. You can replace that inverter and continue on without the system ever going down, just by having breakers on the output of the inverter. So if you're running along and one of your inverters goes bad, you can cut off the DC input, cut off the AC output because it's a breaker on both sides, disconnect those, unplug the Ethernet connection to it, drop a new one in, plug in the Ethernet connection, connect up the output wires, connect the DC wires, flip the breaker on and flip the AC breaker on, and you're back in business and nobody knew the wiser. So, and then if you're doing a 220 system, you have 4 inverters to give you the 220, 2 stacks of slaves. And then if you're doing a 3-phase inverter system for 220 3-phase, then you have a minimum of 6 inverters, and you can stack that all the way up to 36 kW, I believe, is what a Radian is capable of doing now. And that'll run a complete underground complex like the Fortitude Ranch, like you were talking about. So we're going to need you in July, Lee. Is that all right? For about 2 weeks when we wire this up. All right. So we're really getting we're getting deep here. Let's real quick. We don't have much time. We got 20 minutes. Let's get some more critical information on vehicles. What can we do to secure vehicles in the future in the event of EMP, grid down? First of all, what type of vehicles can we have that an EMP will not harm? And if we do have a vehicle that an EMP harms, can we rip out the
all the computers and hotwire it or pop start it? And what kind of vehicle should we have in our tool belt to thrive in the future so that we can get around?
Old stuff. The guy that drives down the road in the 1972 pickup truck is going to keep driving down the road in the 1972 pickup truck, and the guy in the 1988 pickup truck probably isn't. So I recommend vehicles produced prior to 1980 of any ilk. It doesn't matter what manufacturer. Some vehicles didn't have onboard electronics until 1988 because of emissions and so on and so forth. But 1980 is my preferred year. From there back through the 70s. So from 68 through 80 is what I recommend, and a diesel and something that is heavily built. Because you want it to last for a long time. I recommend 4-wheel drive in everything and a manual transmission.
The E350 logging truck, the Ford.
There you go. Or
they're still running around the mountains here doing logging.
Yep, absolutely. The Power Stroke is the older 7.3 Power Stroke is a wonderful engine. Some of the old Cumminses are wonderful engines. If you got to haul stuff around, like you got a camper or a trailer or something of that nature, the International 4600s with the DT 466 engine in it, a manual transmission, 4-wheel drive. Those are awesome trucks. The Navy uses those. The Seabees use them. So there's, older vehicles is what you want to get.
I recently said that I fully believe that older vehicles are going to become very valuable in the future for this very reason, all of the reasons you just stated.
Mad Max, just watched the movie.
Yeah.
Well, we had a dealer here that, and I'm not going to name who they are, but there was a dealer here that had a lot full of these older model cars. And so my fiance and I stopped into the dealership, and we were looking at their vehicles, and we were speaking with one of the owners, and I said, well, you realize that you've got a gold mine here. And she's like, well, what do you mean? And so I explained it, CME, EMP, so on and so forth. These were the vehicles that would operate because there's no onboard, electronics. Everything's solid state. So she's like, oh, really? And I told her about, one of the shows that I'd done and gave her a link or what have you. So we left, didn't pay any more mind to it. 3 days later, we're cruising up the road and go by, and there are signs plastered all over the fence. The fence is chained shut, and there's signs, not for sale, do not ask. The entire lot. So we got a pretty good idea of what they're doing now. They're holding on to those because they know the value of them. And they have filled their parking lot with newer model vehicles and filled the other part of the parking lot with the older model vehicles, and they won't sell any of it. None of it is for sale. They're just holding on to it. And they realize what's going on. And if you look in the agriculture industry, and people go, oh well, not all people know about this. Well, if you look in the agriculture industry and you look at the price of tractors that are the older model tractors that don't have all of these on, computer systems on board, and, the hydraulics as far as the 3-point hitch on the back is controlled by a computer, and the PTO and everything else, the fuel injection. If you look at the price of those tractors, they're going through the roof right now. Why? That's because farmers are paying attention to what's going on with this, realize what's going on because they've been listening to me for years now, and the market is going through the roof for these older tractors that don't have the onboard electronics. So there are tractors that are selling for almost as much as they did new 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. That's the demand, because people realize that's the stuff that's going to keep working. And if they want to be able to feed their family, they've got to have that older stuff. So that's what we purchased. We purchased an older model tractor with no onboard electronics, sold a new one to buy an old one.
Does that work the same way, 1980 and earlier tractor?
Yeah. In tractors, it's 1988 Anything after 1988 in tractors starts having electronics in it. But I prefer the 80s model, and I like the older John Deeres. So depending upon what you're doing, but the older John Deeres from anything from 68 through 80 in John Deere.
Are they propane and diesel and gas, or what are they coming?
They're all diesel. You can convert them to propane, but I'm recommending that everybody stick with diesel and not go to exotics like propane, because I've been asked this question before. And if you don't have a ready supply for propane, then you're screwed. So, people can make alcohol out of corn and so on and so forth and run the tractors on that. That's a whole lot easier to do.
Now we're in this extremely rural area by all the BLM land out here, hundreds of miles from people. There's just a few thousand people for hundreds of thousands of miles out here. The desert Southwest, especially up north where we are. The BLM land is covered with frack wells and substations. Are we going to be able to access this natural gas in a scenario when no one's coming home ever again for our own use safely? Do you know how these facilities work? Can you go get some? Let's go get a propane truck and run out and fill it up.
I would never do that.
You wouldn't do that?
No, I would never do that. You don't know what the gas is that you're getting.
Okay.
You don't know how dirty it is. If you spring a leak and the vehicle you're using is a combustible, or if you don't have the right wrench and you strike a spark, there are lots and lots and lots of people that die every year trying to do that in other countries, and they all die in most cases. And the crazy part about it is when these things go off, so you've got like 5 or 6 guys that are trying to do it, and then you got a crowd of like 10 or 15 people, or maybe even 100 people that are standing around watching them do it, and it explodes and kills 150 people. So so that's the problem with people trying to frack into, get into these things. They don't understand what they're dealing with, and it's not worth your life to do that. You're better off to do something that and is something that you can control. And you're going up there, and you think it's your gas, and the other guy thinks it's his gas, and now you guys are shooting at each other, and it's neither one of yours gas.
No, I think I'd just be happy with a forest fire and going hunting for maybe a deer, and we'll have a feast.
Right.
Now let's talk about more loss of life. I'm over here at Deagle.com. Are you aware of the website?
What is it?
Deagle.com.
No, I have not been on that site.
It's supposedly a military information website compiled from military sources. And it's the site that shows that the forecast for the population in many populated areas around the world is extremely reduced by 2025. I have the U.S. up here. And the forecast for 2025, the current population in 2016 for the U.S., 324 million. In 2025, the population, 54 million.
Oof, ouch.
Okay? And let me just give you some more stats here. The per capita, 57,286 in 2016, is going to drop down to 16,956 by 2025. We're talking a reduction of 34 inhabitants per square mile in the U.S., currently down to 6. What do you think those statistics are reflecting? Starvation, war, migration, or all of the above?
They are reflecting a report that DHS produced 2 years ago, based on John Casey's work.
Okay.
So that's
so
what
this
that
would
reflects.
be in the event of major catastrophes worldwide, including North America.
Yep.
And the resultant infrastructure. It would be a cascading effect, but there would be a huge loss of life. And according to these statistics, 4/5 of the population is missing in 7 years.
Yeah, that's going off of the earthquakes, the volcanic activity, the breakdown of the infrastructure in the United States, the just-in-time delivery. You talked about the New Madrid fault, and the thousands of it. It's 4,785 critical infrastructures along the New Madrid fault would be not damaged, but destroyed by that earthquake and severed. So that's that's DHS's number from one end of the New Madrid to the other of what they saw along there. And then I think there are 74 critical bridges that go across the waterway that would come down. And then there was 50 some major pipelines that crisscrossed back and forth in addition to those 74, and I'm talking major pipelines that went across. Each one of those roadways had pipelines, electrical lines, natural gas, water, so on and so forth that went across with those. I was talking of just the major ones. And again, to reiterate, in the report, it said these systems would not be damaged, but would be completely destroyed.
If you extrapolate from the destruction of that infrastructure, there would be 30 million people exposed to toxic chemicals within a month along the entire Mississippi Valley and along the Gulf of Mexico. They would have to migrate or die.
Yes, because and you're not going to be able to be in those areas even if you didn't have the toxic environment, because of the fact that the infrastructure itself will be gone, and more than likely the Mississippi will change its course, and then you won't have roads or bridges or anything going across that for rail lines or anything. So it will basically sever this country in half, almost all the way up to Chicago, when the New Madrid does break loose. And statistically speaking, we're getting close to that period of time, because and then from Missouri to Louisiana, there will be a wall of fire called the Mississippi River that will burn maybe for years. And that is from, what is the source? All the 4,700 toxic flammable pipelines that are going to leak into that low point called the Mississippi. Well, I don't know if they would burn for years. There would definitely be, fire on the Mississippi like they had when they had one of the other lines severed here, a few years ago. I think the fire was actually going as far as 2.5 miles downstream on the river. That's going to light all the forests for hundreds of miles. Yeah. So it's going to be an interesting time. And it'll make the Oakland quake look like nothing. So there's, lots of things that, the volcanic activity that we've got coming up, the seismic activity that we're already seeing, upticks in both volcanic and seismic activity, and that comes hand in hand with the grand solar minimum. So, it's coming, and there's, 7 faults in the United States, not just the New Madrid. You get so there's the possibility, and all of these major quakes in the United States have like between a 65 and an 85% probability of going off in the next 20 years. So, we're going to see things. We're already seeing minor earthquakes in areas where, we haven't seen them before. And so, and earthquake activity is on the rise. So they're on the way. What else you got, Dave? Well, we also have the Cascadia fault, which is, 50 years overdue for a 9 magnitude and 150 years overdue for a 7+ magnitude, as well as during the Dalton minimum, 7 volcanoes in Cascadia were erupting. You work with John Casey closely. Did he have any predictions on when the Cascadia volcanoes would start to awaken? We've seen some seismic activity near Mount St. Helens and near Rainier, but it's more normal geologic activity than anything imminent. Yeah, I really enjoyed speaking with John Casey. In fact, the last interview that John Casey did before his stroke, I did with him, which was a great interview. And he doesn't give a timeline other than to say that there's the 80% probability. I mean, some of the specs of the, numbers I was quoting were from John. And I hope he's doing well in his recovery. I really miss talking to him. But yeah, he has written all of this in his book Upheaval. So I would highly recommend anybody that wants to know what all of those dates are. He outlines it quite well in his book Upheaval.
Yeah, I've done several videos on his book, Upheaval, and also David Dubine, Adapt 2030, spoke to John Casey over the holidays, and his recovery is going well. So we do have an update on that. And he should be back maybe talking with us in the near future if he decides to do that, because he's getting well enough to do that. Now, that being said, we can be spreading his message as we are. Lee, do you think you might want to join us next week again for another 2 hours?
Absolutely.
Cool.
I enjoy getting the information out there.
Yeah, I'll make up an agenda. We can talk about a whole nother gamut of topics. I'll email it over to you. Is there anyone else you want to plug before we wrap it up tonight?
No, just, like I said, if people want to follow me on Twitter, they can. It's Lee Wheelbarger, Wheelbarger on Twitter. And, read John Casey, Valentina Zarkova, Adapt 2030, you guys. I mean, study the electric universe theory. Because once you understand how the sun works in the electric universe theory, you'll much, much better understand what's going on here. It's plasma physics. In 40 hours, you can understand plasma. So it's not that much. In fact, if you want to go take the courses, you can look at my favorites list on YouTube, and some of the plasma courses that I've taken are actually there on the YouTube page. I think it's under my favorites, or I'll make another file for plasma for people. It's all about getting the information out there and helping people to prepare for what we know is coming. So that's basically all I got.
Awesome, Lee. We can't thank you enough. You're an asset to the community. We can't wait to have you back next week. I want to also shout out Scott McDonough. He is our producer of this show out of Tucson, Arizona. Some people call it Tucson. But if it wasn't for him, we would not be having this radio show, because we have problems with the internet tonight, and this would just not be happening. Leah, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I just wanted to thank Lee. I mean, all of these technological tips and ideas are really helpful. I mean, there's so much to cover in terms of preparedness, and we've covered a heck of a lot, and it can be overwhelming for people. So just, having pointers and getting people started is tremendously useful. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Not a problem. Awesome. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm going to make, as I said, I'm going to make up a bulleted list on some topics that we haven't covered that we'll discuss next week. Maybe we'll talk about water. We'll talk about location. We'll talk about preparedness plans. Maybe that's a bug out situation. You need to get out. Maybe you need to shelter in place. We'll talk about these things because, Lee, you're a military expert, and you probably have some insight, don't you?
Yeah, I got 30 years of making stuff for the military, so
we have plenty to talk about next week here with Lee Wheelbarger. Leah will probably be back. If you guys listening want to follow us, this will be rebroadcast as a podcast in just a few days on our YouTube channel, which is at Oppenheimer Ranch Project on YouTube. We'll also have Oppenheimer Ranch on Facebook. Solar Shutdown is also one of our Facebook sites, as well as Plasma Geology. And I have a little tidbit. I was contacted by David Dubine, who I mentioned tonight. He's going to be coming out here to the ranch this fall, and we're going to be doing some shows live after we get some of the infrastructure set up here. He's really interested to check out our greenhouses, and I hope you guys follow us along for this journey. Lee is providing important information to the community on preparedness, and we're going to continue this dialogue. A couple people asked out there, how come we're not continuing with the chemtrail controversy? And the way I see it is we talked about it. You know the facts. You make up your own mind. You can continue to wear the tinfoil hat, or you can come to reality. Geoengineering is happening, but so is cosmic ray increase, which is causing people to misidentify regular contrails as some covert activity. There are way more important things to worry about in the times that are coming. So stop arguing and start preparing. Now is not the time to be scared. It's the time to be prepared. You don't have to follow the sheeple. You can be your own boss. This is not going to happen alone. You're not going to walk into the woods with a teepee and a fire starter and think you're going to make it. You need to find community. Start preparing now. Learning how to survive and thrive. Join the local wild edibles group. There are so many things that you can do to start to learn how to be prepared for the events that we can't predict. We know that there is an inevitable end, which is not looking good. The more that you dissect this situation, the more grave it looks. But in the end, there are ways to survive and thrive. It's happened before. We've looked at the historical documents. Many people will suffer, but many people survive and thrive in the events that are coming. You need to be prepared. The problem is humanity has been trained not to be prepared. And just in North America, we know that the head of FEMA said that the United States is not a nation of preparedness. So I think what we're going to be seeing in the years to come is more of an air of preparedness coming to North America. Many other countries are far more prepared than we are. And the biggest one, Russia, we should really be looking at, is already doing all the things necessary to survive and thrive in the future. They're spending millions of dollars on infrastructure for greenhouses. They have some of the best cold weather military equipment and training going on. They know what's happening. Other people's eyes are going to be awakening to the changes coming, and you should be too. If this isn't a wake-up call for you to start preparing, I don't know what is. This winter season, as we predicted, was unprecedented. I just reported on records being